all, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. All right, thank you all for joining us. We are so glad to have so many of you here with us tonight to learn about clerkships, what they are, applying to them, the whole system. And a huge thank you to our panelists, Deeva, Greg, and Clara, to joining us all tonight. Before we get started, my name's Emma, my pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the board chair and co-founder of the People's Parity Project. And we've really been involved in advocating in the clerkship space since our founding, knowing that although clerkships are a valuable part of many lawyers' legal careers, that is also a broken system that can really perpetuate some of the worst aspects of the legal profession. So we're so excited to have you all here to learn about what a clerkship is, learn what this process can be, because it is often feels intentionally opaque to law students and pre-law students and even some lawyers. So, and we'll kick it off. Before we get started, just a heads up, if you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. I and the panelists will try to answer quick questions in real time and save others for the end of our discussion. And we also are recording this session, so just wanted to give you all a heads up about that. And with that, I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, since their bios are a big part of what we'll be learning about them tonight. And if you guys could start with what law schools you went to, what jobs you've had, and of course, what clerkships you've had, and why you decided to speak on this panel. And Deeva, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Deeva Shah. I went to the University of Michigan Law School, and I clerked for Judge Wilson on the Central District of California and Judge Raymond Fisher on the Ninth Circuit. And he had to take medical leave, and so I ended up actually working with quite a few different judges on the Ninth Circuit, which was an interesting experience on its own. The reason I wanted to speak on this panel is I'm a first-generation college and law student. I didn't know what a clerkship was when I was in my 1L year, and I didn't really know what to look for when I was applying to clerk or what to even be considering, and kind of did it on a whim without a lot of information and made a lot of decisions without a lot of information. So I'm hoping that other people hopefully can have more information than I did.
Great. And Greg?
Hey everyone, my name is Greg Washington. I'm a 2017 graduate of UC Berkeley. I worked at a law firm in Los Angeles right after graduating from law school, and I clerked for the District of Connecticut for Judge Victor Bolden. And then I've clerked on the 11th Circuit for Judge Adalberto Jordan. And now I am an associate at Kecker and Van Ness. I wanted to be on this panel because I, like Deeva, was pretty late to the clerkship process. I remember when I got back to campus for my second year, people were talking about clerkships, and I felt like I had, sorry about that. I felt like I had completely missed the boat, and I kind of thought that clerkships had passed me by, but I was able to secure 2 clerkships after that, and hopefully I can impart some knowledge and wisdom on you folks that are interested in it, or if you've already gotten a clerkship, kind of pull back the veil so you know what you're getting into.
And Clara.
Great. Well, my name is Clara. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I graduated from Harvard Law School in 2017, and then I went directly to a district court clerkship. I clerked for this on the Southern District of New York, which is in Manhattan, for Judge Denise Coate. And then I clerked on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, also in New York, for Judge Katzman, who at the time was the chief of the Second Circuit. So got a little bit similar to Deeva experience working sort of with other chambers and doing getting a little insight into the Second Circuit more broadly, as opposed to just within the confines of those chambers. Since then, I've been working at the American Civil Liberties Union, the national office here in New York, and I'm an Equal Justice Works Fellow with the Reproductive Freedom Project. I decided to be on this panel, one, because Deeva asked and I said yes, and two, because I actually had a really positive experience clerking overall, and I think it's so important to talk about the application process and the clerkship experience in a sort of a full way that doesn't that demystifies it and doesn't pretend that all clerkships are amazing and that there aren't serious issues, but also I want to lift up good experiences as well and not leave people with the impression that it's all negative. But I think that part of the reason my experiences were positive was because of the ways that I intentionally applied and some of the research that I knew to do beforehand that I hope that I can help impart onto everybody here as well, so that I hope that those of you who do clerk will also have positive experiences.
Thank you. So to take it all a step back, could you guys talk about what is a clerkship and sort of what kinds of clerkships are there? When do people typically apply to clerk? I feel like different points in your careers, and how long is a clerkship?
I can start there. The way I like to think about clerking, although some other people might define it a little differently, is you're kind of a legal advisor to your judge. You're their advocate, and you work on whatever the judge needs you to work on, whether that's on a specific case, figuring out something legal for their standing order, or sometimes just helping the judge figure out how to use their computer. So you can be a lot of different people to your judge when you are clerking. But you clerk after law school. Some judges might require you to pass the bar or have work experience before they accept you. There are both federal and state court clerkships. And there are trial level clerkships for trial courts, appellate level clerkships. And also each clerkship varies based on judge and court. So they're usually 1 year, but some people have 2-year terms, and some people might be a career clerk, which means that is your full-time job and you're there permanently.
Clara or Greg, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think that covers everything.
Yeah, it was great.
I know. I think that was a better explanation of clerkships than I ever got in law school. So, well, with that, what do you see as the benefits of clerking, and why did you decide to apply to clerk? And Clara, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So there are lots, I think, of professional benefits to clerking, in particular for those interested in being litigators. I don't think that clerkships are solely beneficial for those who want to litigate, but I think they are particularly useful for those who want to litigate or who want to find out if they are interested in litigation, because you see every stage of litigation from the inside. And so one of the reasons for me that I really wanted to do both a trial court clerkship and an appellate court clerkship was to see the differences. So what law school really highlights and prioritizes appellate and Supreme Court work. Most of the opinions you're reading in your case books are from the Supreme Court or, sometimes the appellate court. And you learn about things like a motion to dismiss or a motion for summary judgment in civil procedure. But I had no idea what a lawsuit actually looked like when I graduated. And so seeing that and from the inside and seeing every stage of litigation from the filing of a complaint all the way to trial, when I was at the trial court, was a really, incredible learning opportunity for me. And also you get exposed to a plethora of subject matters. So even if you think you're interested in a specific type of law or specific subject matter, when you clerk, for the most part, unless you clerk on specialized courts, which you are able to do, so bankruptcy judges have clerks, and there are some courts that are really involved really only in patent cases. But those aside, if you're clerking sort of on a court of general jurisdiction, you will see cases ranging from large contract disputes to criminal cases to questions involving statutory interpretation. And for me, that was really exciting. I wasn't exactly sure what I was interested in when I graduated college, and excuse me, certainly not college, but also law school. And so to get an inside view of that was really helpful. And now that I'm on the other side, now that I'm a litigator, you know, I can say, I know, at least from experience with my judge, that they really like it when litigators do this, or it's okay if the pin site is like wrong or the comma after the id is italicized, because it turns out no one actually cares about that, right? So like you get to, you learn about what judges do and don't care about, and it demystifies the entire process, I think. And so that's, you know, a real benefit in terms of the actual work that you're doing. And then another ancillary benefit, often, but not always, but often, is the network that you get from your judge. And that's not just the judge, him or herself, who often will act as a real mentor and advocate for their clerks, for not just the job that they're getting after their clerkship, but really for their entire careers. But it's also the network of clerks that have also clerked for that same judge. Most judges host yearly or at least regular clerk reunions where you'll get to meet other clerks who may have clerked for the judge 5, 10, 15 years ago, depending sort of when the judge was nominated and confirmed or elected in the case of a state court judge. And those people will be a professional network for you. And often if you're applying for a job, whether it's at a firm or in a government agency or anywhere else, more likely than not, there may be a clerk who, if not didn't clerk for your specific judge, clerked on your court, right? Clerked for that Ninth Circuit if you're living in California, or clerked for the Central District of California or for the California Supreme Court. And that's a great way, beyond just the network afforded to you from your law school, to build another network of people that you can reach out to. And lastly, I'll just say it's also a signaling mechanism for when applying for jobs. So certain jobs, even if they don't specifically say we want a clerk, you know, if you have clerked, they assume you have a level of knowledge, and they assume you've done certain things beyond, you know, beyond some of the experience you might have had in law school or at a different legal job. And so it is a really attractive position that many legal recruiters look for when looking for people to fill positions.
Great. And with Greg, I'll turn it over to you.
I don't have a huge amount to add to that explanation. I think it was pretty thorough. I'll say that for me, at first, when I heard about clerkships, I thought it was just like another gold star that you look to do after law school. Now, having gone through the process, I see the value in it. And I think that being able to be in the room with the judge while they're making decisions, being able to understand what considerations are important, which ones aren't, and which ones actually move the needle, it informs everything you do on the other side, because you have this intimate knowledge of what the decision-making process is like, and ultimately what is going to help you on this side get your client to a victory. So I think that it's a huge stepping stone professionally. And also, you just get a lot of repetition with things like writing and also just legal discussions, because you're not just talking with your judge, you're talking with your co-clerks. When you're on the appellate level, you're talking with clerks from other chambers. So you're really getting a chance to broaden your horizons in terms of like legal thought processes. And ultimately, you're negotiating all these different sources of information, but also developing your writing and analysis skills in a way that allows you to kind of start to figure out exactly what type of lawyer you want to be and what you think is persuasive, what you think isn't persuasive. If the judge changes something in your opinion, do you agree with that? And do you not agree with that? And you start to like think in the back of your head, like, how would I do this if I'm in this position? So just getting the wheels turning in that sense is something that you really only get in this sort of job.
I'll just make one brief addition, is that it's a really nice transition from law school into real work. If it's something that you can do, you get a chance to basically try out, like, understand what arguments work for a court, but also figure out, like, it's a place where you can kind of make mistakes because you have someone else whose like name is on the order and they're looking at like what you're writing, and they are the ones who will decide whether it should or shouldn't stay. And of course that happens at firms or in public interest, like you have other people whose names might be there, but this is a place where you can try things out and sort of have the academic side of law still, because you're doing a lot of that research and you're still thinking really hard about difficult issues, but not necessarily have it be under your name. So it's a nice place to just ease into work.
So that all sounds great. So with that, we'll change it a little bit. And what are the potential challenges or difficulties of being a clerk? And I think with this, we'll start with Greg.
Sure. I think the biggest challenge for me was more so on the front end of just trying to figure out how to get started with the process and understanding what went into getting a clerkship. Because when you step onto a law school campus, you're kind of inundated with like singular paths. Like you either do corporate or you do litigation. And then you start to hear about this thing like called clerking, and you don't really know where to put that within the spectrum of everything you've been taught so far. So for me, it took like a few months for me to even really wrap my head around what the clerking process would be. And that took me to conversations with, my professors, alums who had clerked to really understand it. And then, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about like the financial difficulties with it. Because you kind of take the hit on two fronts, right? When I was interviewing for clerking, you had to fly out on very short notice to interview with your judge. So that could be something that, the flight alone could cost hundreds of dollars. You probably need some sort of lodging or like to rent a car. So for somebody who has, zero means of income when you're in law school, that's a tough pill to swallow and a tough thing to get over. I do think that now with more digital interviews and that becoming the norm, it could actually democratize clerkships a lot more because you don't have that initial hurdle to get over. And then the other hard part is, you're going to be working in the federal government, and being a clerk is great experience-wise, but not so much pay-wise. So if you have the opportunity to like work at a big law firm, you're going to take a significant pay cut before you start clerking. So that's another consideration, especially with me. Like I'm the first person in my family to have, one of these highly prestigious jobs, and the first generation of going to college. So it's a very big commitment to say that I'm going to take $100,000 pay cut to take this job with the hope that it pays off dividends in the future. So that in itself is like a very hard thing to get over. At least it was for me. And I think that is just like the difficulty of getting into sort of the part of your law school that talks about clerkships is hard, but also like once you're there, being able to financially support the idea and the dream of getting that clerkship is also a very hard thing too.
Yeah, I can to add to that. So I'll just flag one of the things we'll talk about later too, but clerkships aren't for everyone, and that's for a lot of different reasons. Either the work you're going to be doing later, it's not the right fit. Financially, it's not good timing, and once you've been working for 5 or 6 years, it can be really hard to want to leave that to go clerk. And then there's also other concerns like location, for example. You can't really pick where you clerk necessarily. You can try your best to, but if you're trying to apply to a bunch of judges and you just want a clerkship, it means you might end up in a place that you don't know anyone, you don't really have community or support. And I think for a lot of people who are first generation students or people of color or diverse in other ways, the idea of living in a place that you don't have your support network can be particularly difficult. Also for people who have families or just a significant other, that was a concern for me. And the other thing that I believe Tyler just hinted at a little bit is that not every chambers is perfect, and their judges can be difficult to work with. I'm sure you all have seen the news about certain judges not treating their clerks well, abusing them, harassing them, and it's hard to learn that information and know who to clerk for and who not to clerk for. And this golden star that Greg is talking about isn't always as shiny once you're actually, there. And so it's hard to know about that and to know whether what you're getting into, just because it's talked about so much, is actually going to give you that kind of experience. And so I think the environment can be hard. And then finally, I'll just say the steep learning curve. For those, especially people who maybe aren't so familiar with being in this kind of legal work environment, it can be really hard to pick that up right out of law school.
If I can just jump in real quick, I saw Tyler's question, and I think that he raises a really important point, which is that the clerkship experience is really like you and then 3 to 5 other people for an entire year at a time. So if there's one sort of negative either personality or a boss within that, the entire experience can be changed very quickly. So that's something where you want to, especially on the front end, try to do due diligence and talk to people if they haven't clerked for that judge who have clerked around that area, and they may have information about what it's like to work for that person. Because no matter how shiny a gold star is, if you're going to regret a year of your life, or maybe even 2 years for a 2-year clerkship in these positions, then it's not necessarily worth it.
And Clara?
No, I'm glad Greg said that, because that was along the lines of what I would have added. And I think there's only so much research you can do ahead of time especially from those who have clerked before, but you really can't have no control over who your co-clerks are going to be. I was in a really lucky position because my first clerkship, there were 3 of us, and the third person who was supposed to come quit unexpectedly a week before she was supposed to come. So we were in the bizarre position of interviewing for my co-clerk. And so I actually got a say in who I was going to be working with, which was unique and certainly not the case for pretty much everybody else. And so you have to, like with many other work environments, there may be personalities that you don't get along with, or, that you don't jive with, but, it's much more difficult to deal with that if you're working in close quarters. Some chambers, you're literally in the same office as your co-clerks, and where there's a real stigma of leaving a clerkship early in cases when things are really bad. It's almost unheard of to leave a clerkship early because of all of the judgments and assumptions that come with that. And so knowing that you're essentially locked in for that year, kind of no matter how bad it gets, is definitely difficult. I think, to take a step back though, oh, well, Jill just asked a question about this, about if there are risks to leaving a clerkship if it turns out that you don't get along with the judge or think the judge is difficult. And the honest answer is yes, there are risks. One of the risks is you likely won't get the benefit of sort of all of that professional network that we touched on earlier. And the other risk is that there will be questions. People will wonder why you left early, because, everyone knows that a clerkship is a year, or in some cases 2 years. And so if your clerkship is 5 months or 6 months on your resume, it will flag it will flag questions. I think Deeva can speak a little bit better about kind of the implications about that and what you can do to mitigate that. So I'll leave it to you, Deeva.
Yes, so I think that ideally there would not be repercussions if you left, but of course that isn't actually the case. And so there are ways to deal with these issues through the judiciary, and there are employment dispute resolution processes. And should you ever find yourself in that situation, People's Parity Project has a webpage, and you can go there. You can email a secure account and seek advice. Even if we can't give you legal advice, we can point you to someone who might be able to help you. But there are procedures in place. I think we'll talk about this a little bit at the end. I've testified in front of Congress about the many issues that I think that exist with those procedures, because retaliation, I think in this sense, is really hard to address. You have one boss, that person is your is the reference that you have from that year. No one is going to call someone else in that chambers necessarily to understand whether you did good work or not. And so it can be very difficult to report that behavior. It's why we do see problems, and it's just where some of the negative issues in clerkships come up with. You're in like a feudal system. Your judge is like the landlord or the lord of that area, and they like run their chambers the way that they want to. And there are reasons why that makes sense, but there are also reasons why that makes it very difficult to leave a bad environment.
So I know that this theme is going to continue to come up as we answer more of the questions, and it's such an important topic. And I think has, at least even 2 years ago when I was applying for clerkships, people were not talking about this openly. It was all, text messages and whispers between friends. So I'm just so glad that this has become a more open forum for these conversations. Just to turn it back quickly to sort of some of the logistics as you think about applying for clerkships. It would be great if you guys could explain the difference between state and federal clerkships, and then also between, and I know you guys have touched on this a little bit, between appellate or trial level and magistrate clerkships.
I can try to put some color to the state versus
Perfect.
federal. So with state courts, most of your states are going to have some sort of like trial court, an intermediate appellate court, and then also a state Supreme Court. They go by different names depending on the states, but generally they're going to focus on the important laws of those states. And if you know a bit about the 10th Amendment, it's like health, safety, welfare, like all of those major topics are going to be discussed in a state court more so than a lot of your federal courts, because they deal with like very individualized things within that state. I also think I almost actually clerked for a state court, and I think it's a really unique opportunity to understand the inner workings of the laws of that state and that jurisdiction. So if you want to practice, say, in New York, and you want to clerk for the New York, I think it's Court of Appeal, that could be a great experience for you to understand what it's like to be a practitioner in that area. And that can give you a bird's eye view into like what the law means within that state. So it's a huge advantage. But also I think the federal courts are also going to give you a lot of that too, just because, especially at the district court level, when you sit by diversity jurisdiction, you're applying the law of whatever state that issue kind of arose out of. So you get a chance to see a lot of these sort of individual nuggets of what it's like to work in a state court. So it's different, but ultimately I think the federal system is kind of like more holistic in that it's like everything is kind of like connected to something else. Whereas the states are more insular, and you're kind of focused on the laws and statutes of that state and sort of perfecting and understanding those. Versus when you're in a federal court, like you can get a forum selection clause from like Iowa, and then you have to decide things under Iowa law. Or you could have something that has a really unique twist because it happened in Florida. Like it all like kind of, it can be a little bit of a choose your own adventure type of experience.
Yeah, one thing I'd add is, I earlier I mentioned how law schools really prize sort of appellate and Supreme Court litigation over trial litigation, at least in the 1L curriculum. And that's also true of federal law over state law. And that at least, at Harvard, I found that state court clerkships were not as shiny of a gold star as federal clerkships. And I think that's a mistake and a real shame. So much of legal practice happens in the state courts. And unlike the federal courts, which are sort of a unified system and we all know the federal rules of civil procedure, and what happens in the Ninth Circuit isn't so different than what happens in the Second Circuit. The state courts are the wild, wild west. And if you're going to be practicing in state court in a state, if you think you're going to be living in California and practicing at least somewhat in California state court, or New York somewhat in state court, knowing the ins and outs of the state system is so valuable to whatever legal office you're going to be going to, because so few people have that insight and that experience. And because the rules are so different and the practices are so different state to state. I just think that there's such benefit to working in the state system, especially if you can get to sort of the state's highest courts. It's really, and I think a real shame that a lot of law schools don't sort of prioritize or highlight those clerkships as much as they do the federal clerkships. And, if you know you're going to be practicing in North Carolina, I would tell you that it is more worth your time to look at North Carolina state courts than it is to go to the District Court of Oregon, for example, if you know that about sort of your future and where you're going to be. I also think if you're thinking about geographic considerations, like Deeva mentioned earlier, where you really, because of family constraints or other constraints, can really only be in one area, you should not write off state courts. And that really blows open the possibilities of courts that you can clerk on. And so I just want to, as someone who didn't clerk on a state court and sort of regrets it because it turns out the majority of my practice is in state court, I wish I had that insight.
That's super, super helpful. I think similarly, like state court clerkships just did not get discussed, and I think it does a real disservice to applicants. So just to sort of go into what the day, and again, I know you guys have touched on this a little bit, but I think it would be helpful. What does the day-to-day life of a clerk look like? I'm honestly just gonna let whoever wants to go jump in first. Jump in.
I'll go ahead and just do a quick version of this. It depends obviously for your court and for your judge, but for example, in a trial court, the way my week looked was on days where we didn't have hearings, I would spend a lot of the day researching and drafting orders, or writing a memo for a particularly difficult case, discussing it with the judge. But then on days where we did have hearings, I would get there an hour or two before the hearing, make sure that the judge was prepared for those hearings, and deal with any issues as they arose during the day. These things change, especially when you're in the middle of trial. I had 7 trials during my district court clerkship, and that you're not doing anything else when you're in trial, and especially if it's a bench trial, you're basically, it's thinking through each one of those issues, thinking through the testimony as it's happening, because it's the judge who's going to have to put out an order and rule on the case at the end. And so it can be very different. Appellate courts are a little more predictable with bench memos. You have a calendar week, and in between, you're really just, your day-to-day can look very similar, I think, on an appellate court more than it can for a trial court. And I'll add also on the trial court, there's a lot more emergency work like TROs, and you might have things come up that you just don't expect. That is a little bit rarer at the appellate court.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it also goes into like the differences between the trial court and the appeals court a little bit, because at the trial court, you're kind of governed by lists and deadlines. So one thing at the district court, at least federally, you have the 6-month list and the 3-year list. And the short version of that is like the 6-month list is like if any motion has been pending for 6 months, your judge is put on a list that gets sent to Congress. Same thing for any case that's been pending for more than 3 years. So you're kind of governed, and you work backwards from those lists to deal with everything that happens within that case. So it's very formulaic, but it's also very dynamic in that, like Deeva said, you could get a TRO dropped on you on a Tuesday, and then you have to have a hearing Tuesday afternoon, and that kind of like changes the way the rest of your week looks. But you also get, I think, a lot more of variety in terms of what happens there, because you get to see so many different types of lawyers and advocates at the trial level. Whether it be in a trial or in a motion hearing, you get to see kind of a better sense of like what works for certain advocates and what doesn't work for others. I also think that with the appellate level, it's very formulaic in that like every 2 months or so, you have a calendar week, and then like you spend the rest of your time kind of like a hermit figuring out what the law is. And then like you come out and you present what that is to the judge, and like then they present it to the other judges, and it's very sort of like very ivory tower like, where you're kind of just like talking with these other very intelligent lawyers about what the law could be or like what it is, versus a trial court, like you're really trying to get to the heart of what people's problems are and figuring out like whether or not they can seek redress in the way that they've sought. So I feel like it's a very different dynamic to work at a trial court level.
So hopefully you guys, everyone has a sense of, to the degree that you can, what your day-to-day might look like or what it might not look like. So I think probably the reason a lot of you are here is to get a sense of what the application process generally looks like. I know that all three of you have a lot of tips and advice to give. I will say, despite the very hard sell we have just gotten on how amazing state court clerkships are, another part of the complication is it's not a unified hiring process. Every state is going to have its own process. And so I don't think any of us are particularly well equipped to speak to that, the details of that process, but the overarching components of what you'll need in an application at least will be the same, even if like the online portal where you go to submit it is completely different. So just with that caveat for this advice. It'd be great to hear from you guys what the application process generally looks like, and then what the components of an application generally are. And maybe Clara, we'll start with you.
Sure. So, I mean, there's no better way to describe it than just like a flaming hot mess. And that's saying that now even many courts, not all though, many federal courts are now in theory on a clerkship hiring schedule. They call it the plan. That just confuses it. Just call it a schedule where judges in theory will not look at applicants before they have their second semester of 2L grades. Back in the day, it was every woman for herself. Is that right, Emma? Did I get that wrong? Or is it summer after 2L? Is that right?
It's the summer after 2L.
Okay.
And I will just say, it's a summer after 2 hour. Not every single judge is on the plan. Most still are.
Right. So most are, but not all. And it's hard to find out which ones are not. But for those judges that are on the plan, it will be the summer after your 2L, when you get your 2L spring grades. You will apply, and it will usually be through an online portal called Oscar. I couldn't tell you what it stands for. Maybe someone else could. But similar to the Common App, if you use that in college, that's a place where you can upload your transcript, your resume, a writing sample, your information for your references, the general pointers I was given when applying for a cover letter was that a cover letter, unlike when you're applying for a job, is not, many paragraphs long. This is why I'm qualified. It's really to the point. My name is blank. I graduated or will graduate on this day. I'm on this journal. Here are my references. It's like half a page, if that. And then you send them out and you wait. And that's how it's supposed to go. How it really goes is that people, professors or practitioners or former clerks, pick up the phone and they call judges with whom they have connections, either because they clerked for that judge or because they went to law school with that judge or because their wives are friends, and they advocate for the student, for the applicant. And sometimes that goes over very well with a judge. Sometimes a judge will only interview people for whom they've gotten personalized phone calls. Other judges don't want to pick up the phone, have nothing, don't want to deal with this at all. Other judges, it's just luck of the draw. Maybe they were in one morning and they happened to be between two, sittings on the bench, and they picked up the phone. And if the professor had called half an hour ago, they never would have spoken to that person. And so a lot of it is a crapshoot. For those judges that are not on the hiring plan, some will take applicants as early as their 1L year, will take applicants as early as right after their 1L year. It's a really opaque process. It's a process that doesn't make any sense. It's a process that often leaves you demoralized because you don't get rejection letters. Your applications often just sit and you don't know if they're being considered or not. You don't know if they've hired or not. My judge, my Second Circuit judge the summer that I was there and we were taking applicants. Between the plan opening up, it was a Monday at 9 a.m. or something, we finished our hiring by Tuesday at noon, right? That it was less than 48 hours. And that's insane. And we tried to talk him out of it, but judges are convinced that if they don't act first, then some other judge down the hall is going to get the stellar clerk who will then go on to the Supreme Court and do all these amazing things, and they could have had that clerk. And so it's very crazy and frustrating. That said, all of that said, those are the crazy judges, and they fill up their clerkships like the days or week after the plan opens. But then things settle down. The non-crazy judges then say, okay, those people have gotten their people. Now let me look at this reasonably and rationally and on my own timeline. And because they know that there are so many amazing law students out there, and that the 30 that were picked for this, by the judges that go crazy in the first 24, 48 hours, sure, they'll probably be good clerks, but they also might not be, right? Because having great grades and being on law review does not a good clerk make. And so there are judges who go much more slowly, who want more information, who take their time, which is great, but also just adds to the confusion and adds to the stress that as an applicant you feel, because you've heard about your classmates who've already gotten interviews and who have already gotten hired, and you haven't heard anything from any judges. And so you don't know if you're even under consideration anymore. So all of this to say, and I'm sorry that I'm rambling, but this is something I feel very passionately about, which is the stress that we put these students under is so unnecessary and so cruel, frankly. And, I do believe that, it works out for people. If you really want to clerk, it will work out, because even if you don't get a clerkship that first time, that first, wave of applications after the plan opens, if you keep going and keep applying and apply more broadly and look to judges that aren't necessarily hiring in that quick fire way, it'll work out. But it's not easy, it's not fun, and there's no way to sugarcoat it.
I feel like that did a great job of talking through the application process. So to keep us moving a little bit, but also because I think it gets at the same thing, I'd love to hear from each of you about what advice you'd give to students who are about to potentially apply for clerkships, or in June apply for clerkships, and then be interviewing with judges soon thereafter. And Deeva, we can start with you.
So I'll say, one, I think do your research, think carefully about which judges you want to apply for. And this isn't just research in terms of, which judges are in which circuit or district or in cities that you like or don't like, but talking to people who have clerked on those courts, talking to former clerks, use your law school's network, use your friends, use whatever connections you can, people at your summer job who clerked, and talk to them about the courts they clerked on. I think that you'll find that there's kind of an unspoken rule that most people won't say negative things about their own judge, and that if they do, it'll be if you call them and you're talking on the phone. But what they will do is tell you all about the other judges in their courthouse. And so even if you don't know specifically what their judge is, might not be someone who you are applying to, use your connections, learn about who on that court is known to be maybe someone who isn't great to clerk for or is great to clerk for. One other thing I'll say, especially for candidates that are diverse in whatever sense of the word you want to count diversity, you're a person of color, you're diverse because of your sexual orientation, whatever you see as your diversity, the application process and the materials can sometimes wipe away who you are as a person, but there are ways to bring your holistic self to your application. So think about ways to, in your recommendation letters, have your recommenders talk about things. I wrote a diversity statement for law school that I gave to all of my professors, who then talked about my first generation background in my rec letters, so that there was a way for that to come through, even though I couldn't really talk about it in the cover letter. I'll say one difference is I did end up having a long cover letter to explain some of my background that wouldn't be evident, but also the way that you pick a writing sample, what interests you're showing, be holistic, think about who you are as a person and who you want to present, and don't, just think about not hiding your full self, because if there's a reason that your full self would not be great for some reason in that chambers or would not be accepted, that's also a really important factor for you to know.
Greg, or Clara, do you want to add anything?
I'll add a couple things. I think that one thing that I saw coming up in the chat a lot is, should you clerk right after graduating from law school? And I took a year before I clerked because my judge preferred having clerks with more work experience. And in hindsight, I would rather have maybe done like 2, maybe even 3 years before clerking, just because during that first year to 2 years after law school, you're so busy trying to learn everything and see it for the first time that you don't necessarily have the capacity to take a step back and realize and start putting things together. And I think that in a clerkship, because there's so much happening and you're exposed to so many things, it may be good to have like 2 to 3 years where you can kind of contextualize the things that are getting thrown at you, and you can kind of put that into the longer arc of your career. So I think that I would advocate for folks to maybe take a couple years before clerking. I think that's a great thing. And also, just because Oscar opens up, in what is it, June after your 2L year, you can just wait and apply in the fall and then maybe get a clerkship 1 or 2 years out. Like there's no, like once it's open to you, it's open to you, and you can even wait until you start practicing before you apply for a clerkship. And another point that I want to talk about is maybe a bit of what we're speaking on the application front. I, like Deeva, I wrote a lot about who I am as a person in my cover letter, and I think that kind of distinguished me from a lot of other applicants, because I talked about being the first lawyer in my family, because I talked about like the unique experience that I've had as an African American male, and learning about the legal system and what it means. I was able to articulate like why I would be a unique asset to a court and to help a judge make those decisions. So I think that can also play a role. And then also one more tag along I'll add is, don't be afraid of paper applications. I know that everything is kind of pushed to be funneled through Oscar, and it's a great clearinghouse for these sorts of things, but there is something about the personal touch of sending out paper applications that I think is very powerful. I know that for my circuit court clerkship, I only sent out paper applications, and I got more interviews than I thought I would. And I think it's largely because I took the time to send everything in paper form. So you're more likely, I think, to have at least someone put a set of eyes on it, which I think with Oscar, because everything's coming in digitally, you're kind of just trying to get through it all. So if you send a fully formed paper application that tells the judge and the chambers like who you are as a person, what you're going to bring to their courtroom, and why your experiences have set you up to be an excellent clerk, I feel like that is a package that is something that's really a treat. I know I got this a couple times as a clerk too. It's really a treat to see somebody put thought and effort into doing things in a paper application, and you'll like put those applications off to the side and you'll hand them to the judge personally, which gets that set of eyes on them. So like, especially if you're new to the process, I would highly recommend going the paper application route.
I will add one note, as I also did a bunch of paper applications. If you are trying to go on the hiring plan and therefore get them to their chambers the same day that Oscar opens, which is when they can start to look at them, send them earlier than I did. I don't remember what day I chose, so I cannot give you better advice, but especially with the post office the way it is, really look at how long it's going to take them to get there. We should not talk about how much money I spent at FedEx. It was a scary number that I'm not entirely sure I meant to do. So that is, if you are going to go the paper route, do be intentional about it. Maybe 2 weeks before, not 4 days before.
Yes, I'll just echo one thing that Greg said. I acknowledge that those of us on this panel right now have a lot of privilege. We're at T14. We went to T14 law schools. We probably did well for one reason or another. And Some of that is not privilege and obviously is a lot of hard work too, but I'm just saying that for people who are at T14 law schools and you're applying digitally, you're probably not the person getting filtered out. So I didn't necessarily have to worry about that when I applied digitally. So one extra reason why Greg is so right about the paper applications is judges will filter by school, judges will filter by grades, will filter by other things. You cannot filter paper so easily. And so for those of you who are not at schools that maybe are as highly ranked and for 1,000 reasons, I think it's a bad idea that judges are not more thoughtful about hiring from schools, and look at these rankings. But just it's one easy way to avoid getting knocked out of the pile.
So I think that's probably, oh, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to build off of something Greg said earlier about clerking after some work experience. And it actually dovetails really well with what Deeva was just talking about, because if for whatever reason your 1L or 2L grades weren't that great, or you go to a law school that isn't as highly ranked as you wish it were, you can offset that by great work experience, right? So the further removed you are from law school, the more additional things you have to show. All right, you can say, in my 2 years of practice, I have litigated this many cases, or I have been in front of this court, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a great way also to get noticed by a judge and to stand out for a judge in your application. And so even if you don't get hired right after your 2L summer, that is absolutely not the end of the road. And I know a lot of people who have waited until they've actually practiced to apply. And as sort of an add-on to that also, it's also a great career shift, right? It's not as scary to go to a job that you're not 100% sure about, or whatever it is, if maybe in a year or two you might leave and clerk. And I know people who were unhappy professionally, clerked, and then that was a great pivot moment for them to go into a different field of law or to do something else. And so I would not get into the mindset of clerking right after law school is the end all be all. So I think Greg's absolutely right on that score.
So I think all of this and the time are a perfect segue to our last question. I think hopefully you all got a lot of practical advice about what a clerkship is, why you might want to do it, and how you would embark on the relatively daunting process of applying. But with that, and given the title of the panel, I'd love to sort of hear from the three of you about why we still say that the clerkship system is in fact broken, given that it clearly was such an amazing part of each of your careers. And Clara, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So, I think as my rant about the application process is a good window into what I think are some real problems that the clerkship system faces, and that it's really not it's very uneven and unequal right from the beginning, right? And like Deeva talked about, many judges sort based on law school, sort based on grades, or pick people based on personal connections. So obviously that means that the group of clerks that ultimately end up somewhere are not going to reflect the diversity of experiences at law school and of lived experiences in this country. And as long as that's the case, then the law will remain broken, because those who interpret and apply the law are not individuals who actually reflect those who practice law or who live within the bounds of the law, right? Everybody who lives in this country. And so we have to think really critically, not just about who our judges are, but also who the people behind them are. And I think that can be hugely problematic when, dealing with criminal law, especially if you're a district court judge and you're sentencing people, or issues of statutory interpretation even, which have serious implications for the country more broadly. And so for me, I think it's so important not to divorce clerkships from the rest of the legal system, and with the problems that we see within, especially with respect to representation within clerkships, is just a microcosm for the larger problems that we still face in the law more broadly.
Yeah,
go ahead, Greg.
I was going to say, I agree with everything that Clara said there. I think one of the reasons at least why I think that the clerkship process is rigged, is because you really only have one party that cares about having any sort of representation within the judiciary. So when you have inputs that are so slanted and skewed towards old white men and men who have largely come from either law firm partnerships or like high level government jobs, you create like, you're only pulling from a very narrow ecosystem. And even, to be honest, the Democrats don't do a great job of this either. Like they're looking for people who have been law firm partners, who have these sort of, like great government appointments where you can say like, oh, this person checks all the boxes. And ultimately you like look back on how they got to that point. It's because they went to Harvard or Yale or Stanford. It's because they had the opportunity to do these clerkships at the outset. And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where like you look for people who validate the entirety of your experiences that you had beforehand. So you get the same types of people that come into these systems. And I think that ultimately the idea of who should be a judge needs to be broader than a judge, and then also a clerk needs to be broader than what it is. Like people who work for civil rights organizations should be judges. People who are public defenders should be judges. People who help people with prisoner habeas relief, like those people should be judges, because those are very important parts of the system. And that's not necessarily the experiences that people are looking for. So I think that there's a lot of problems within the process of both clerking and also the judiciary more broadly. But like we need to, and part of it's like, putting the cart before the horse, but like we need people who are good people who have come from unique backgrounds to apply to these prestigious jobs and get them, so that they can help lift up people who come after them. And I hate to like put that sort of burden on folks who, maybe the first in their family to go to college, but it's a responsibility and a duty that I think that we all have to try to help those who come after us, which is why I do this sort of thing as much as I can, is because I want folks who maybe weren't going to apply to clerkships to at the very least apply, start the process, and give themselves a shot to be like, a judge 10, 12 years down the road, so that you have like that special golden ticket that we've been talking about this entire time that gets you into those strata and you can start to make the change.
Before I turn it over to Deeva for closing remarks, I know at least Deeva and I, and maybe Clara and Greg, sorry to spring this on you, are happy to stay in the Zoom room for the next 10, 15 minutes after we close the panel, answer more questions directly, whether that's in the chat or via Zoom. And people have also put their emails in the chat button if you want to email direct questions to any of the panelists. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deeva.
So I won't repeat everything that Clara and Greg have said, but I agree with it 100%. And I'll just say that the system is set up with built-in discrimination. And the only way to address that is to confront that head on in different ways, but also to make sure that people who are discriminated against have an ability to be a part of that system and change those views and have these positions, even if they are harder to get. And that puts a lot of work, as Greg said, on the very same people who have been discriminated against or maybe cannot find these jobs. Or get to clerkships as easily. And so I think it's important to break that down. If you want a really long piece about why this problem exists, there is a piece that Professor Leah Lippman from Michigan and I wrote. It's in the Northwestern University Law Review. I can, once I'm done talking, I can also put a link in the chat. There are a lot of reasons why I think that the system is broken, but there's also two other reasons that I think we should discuss just briefly. First, finding out information about judges is hard, and finding it is the people who have connections to people in the law, the people who go to law schools that have these massive banks of information on prior clerks and notes. Those are the people who also are privileged enough to have the whisper networks and have access to them. So once again, even doing this kind of research and telling you to do this research, I want to acknowledge that doing this research itself is hard and also is geared towards helping people with privilege easily find that information and not necessarily helping other people. And so consider me, other people on this panel as your network, and consider alumni from your school as your network. But there is a problem, and we're hoping to address that with the judiciary and with law schools, because they hold a ton of information that sometimes just isn't passed on to the right people. But speaking of the judiciary, I'll say that to the extent that these problems also do exist, reporting is really hard. Someone mentioned earlier that there are circuit directors of workplace relations, and there's a National Office of Judicial Integrity. I think that there are positions, just like in any job, to report things, but if you would like to understand why I and other members of PPP and other organizations find that those methods are just simply not enough to deal with these issues, you can look on the PPP website for more information, or go to Law Clerks for Workplace Accountability, which has a lot of that information as well. I will say that if you look at Olivia Warren's testimony, she spoke about the harassment she faced in Judge Reinhardt's chambers. She had a lot of trouble reporting even to those avenues after they were created. And so I will say, for any of you who decide to clerk, who go into an interview or have trouble related to discrimination, reporting is hard. It can be even harder within a system that has a lot of power concentrated against you. And so please seek out resources, email us, think through if you face these issues in your clerkship or even in applying. We're hoping that you have the information to make the best decision for each of you. I love my clerkship, to be clear, both of them. And I think that people can gain a lot of positive things from clerkships, but they're not for everyone. And they are, the system is still broken.
Thank you so much, Deeva, for ending on that sobering but incredibly important work. And I will just echo everything Deeva said about where you can find out more about some of the sort of systemic problems throughout the judiciary. The PPP website is peoplesparity.org/clerkships. And then we have a whole page on all the issues that Deeva just mentioned. And I also put a couple of resources in the chat as well. With that, a huge thank you to Deeva, Greg, and Clara for sharing all of their wisdom with us tonight, and with all of you for spending the evening with us. As I said, we will be here for another 10 minutes. If you have questions, if a bunch of people are sticking around to ask questions, we can also, I think, throw people into breakout rooms quickly. But if not, just throw them in the chat and we'll try to take them quickly.
Greg and Clara, while we're waiting for questions, just going to say I'm interested to hear in your experiences, like how much your work, like day-to-day, changed between your two clerkships.
Oh my gosh, world of difference.
Yeah.
My district court clerkship was I've described it as being in a cold call class all day, every day for a full year. And that, like, I was always on the edge of my seat. My judge had a habit of, like, the clerks all shared an office. So 3 of us in sort of one big room. And she just had a habit of, like, walking in and being like, you clerk, like, what's the update on this case? Or have you done this? Or like, oh, can we talk about this? And so you just, like, always had to be ready. So we had sort of like a informal no phones policy, and like we kind of like had our movement had to be accounted for, like, at all times, not because like we weren't allowed to go somewhere, but because like she wanted to know if we weren't there, she wanted to know, right? So it's like, oh, I'm like, even if it was grabbing coffee, like I would let my co-clerks know so that like if she came in, like it was like if people knew where I was. So it was like very like stressful in that way. It was also very like butts in seats, like computer on, ready to go at 9 a.m., which meant like in reality getting to work, around 8:45 every day. And we had an unwritten rule that like we would not leave until the judge left, right? And that could be anywhere from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., depending on like if she had things on that night. And even if she was not working on anything that was related to me, we stuck around. And so there were canceled plans and there were, frustrations. And that was crappy. But like the majority of the time she left at a reasonable hour, but there was like no way to know. So like we also ate lunch together every day. And so like at lunchtime, like I was the only one brave enough to like, so judge, like, do you have plans tonight? Like, ooh, like, and, you know, and
at 7?
yeah, exactly. Like, oh, the opera, what time does that start? Are you having dinner before? Just, oh, that would sounds so nice, you know, like just trying to game it out. And so like, it was very intense. Like, my time was not my time. I did not make plans. I did not take federal holidays for granted or even weekends. Massive change to the appellate court. Appellate court was chill AF. Other than when we were sitting during the sitting weeks, you know, it was like we had to be there at a specific time, like in suits. Oh yeah, district court, I wore a suit every day because you could be called into the court. There could be a TRO motion, there could be anything, you know, whereas the appellate court was much more like business casual. Like, unless you were sitting, we rocked in 10-ish, maybe. You know, some days the judge just like never showed up, and we're like, all right, like let's go for a long lunch. And it felt much more like law school, where it was like, just get your work done. As long as your work is done, it doesn't really matter sort of where you are, and we trust you. And there just wasn't, you didn't need to have your butt in the seat all the time, because there were hardly ever emergencies, right, at the appellate court that you have to respond to. And so I would say it was like much more relaxed. And I was very thankful to have that after the district court, because like I felt like I could breathe. And like I went on my honeymoon during my appellate clerkship, and like I cleared that with my judge ahead of time. Like I got a week and a half off during that time. And that, you know, was something that there's no way that would have happened during my district court clerkship.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to try and just throw them at you guys rapid fire. How many judges did you guys apply to? And did you target a geographical location, or did you apply broadly? I will answer this one first because I've applied but not clerked. I think I applied to around 80, but honestly, I've tried to block out the process. I did not target a geographical location. I'm also single and mobile for the time being, though I didn't apply to places I couldn't live. Like, I just remember staring at a profile for a judge, I think in West Virginia, and they sounded cool, and it was, and I was just like, I can't, I'm a like native New Yorker. I at a certain point realized I had to be realistic. I don't know if that was helpful.
I think that's right. I applied to, I want to say it's less than 100, but definitely more than 50 to get my clerkships. I think that in the beginning, I was doing like this scattershot approach, mostly because that's what they told you coming out in law school, of like, you have to apply broadly, you have to apply to these places. There are great judges in Wyoming. And I applied, and then I remember very vividly, I got an interview for Oklahoma City for a clerkship. And I was like, I don't know how to get to Oklahoma City, or like where it would be on a map. So this might not be for me. So with that being said, I think follow Emma's advice of like picking the cities that you can live with for a year, and you can live in those cities and not have a terrible experience, because, you know, moving to those places is isolating, and you shouldn't move anywhere that you don't feel comfortable. Like, I firmly believe that there were certain southern states that I just wasn't going to move to because of a long history of not liking my people. So I just wasn't going to do it. So yeah, be judicious on the front end.
Yeah, I will agree with Greg, and I'll combine this with Madison's question about people who aren't at a T14. I think there's a little bit of a similarity, either if you have lower grades or you're not at a T14, and that like some judges just like are primed not to consider you. And I think that for that reason, applying more broadly can be your friend. So I think I applied to at least 100 clerkships. And for me, I staggered. So like there's a limit apparently on Oscar. I forget what the limit is on how many you can send out. And then I like divided between the ones that I knew I could send paper to, and I only applied on Oscar to the ones where they like said no paper applications, like, or like didn't provide information. And then I was geographically bound somewhat. My now husband was in the Bay. I wanted to be at least in the same time zone after having spent 3 years not being there. So like there are tons of these considerations. So I staggered my applications and applied to like California and the West Coast first, and then sort of like moved east. You know, like every few weeks, if I was like, I haven't had any bites, then I would like send out another 25 or 30. And so think about what makes the most sense for you. But also if you're at if you aren't attending a T14, I actually did a Twitter thread on this, so I won't repeat it. But either at the end of this call, or if you just go on my Twitter, it's one of the most recent things that I talked about, and a bunch of other people commented with advice. So I think it might be easier to just go there for really specific advice about, like, if you're not at a T14, what you can do to stand out more.
I'm going to talk a little bit about application process and then combine that with Justin's question about fellowships. My clerkship application process was atypical and not the norm. I applied for a handful of appellate court judges. I was very geographically restricted due to like family and personal concerns. And to be honest, I had really good grades from Harvard, so I wasn't like truly concerned. And so I applied to a bunch of Second Circuit judges, and then I got Judge Katzman, and Judge Katzman actually requires that his clerks clerk for a district court first, because he wants his clerks to know what a case looks like before it gets to him, which I think is really smart and makes his clerks better. And so he helped me with my district court applications because it was a prerequisite. And so there were a handful of judges I was interested in clerking for at the Southern District of New York. And I applied to, I want to say somewhere between 5 and 10. And Judge Katzman told them they should hire me because I was going to be clerking for him. So not your typical process and not how it's supposed, not how it goes for 99% of the people, but it just sort of goes to show that, there are roundabout ways and that these things work. As for those who are interested in applying for fellowships, which, my God, is a whole other system that is just ridiculous and stupid, frankly. The whole fellowship process in the legal profession is a racket. It makes no sense. Law firms shouldn't be paying people to work at the ACLU. They should just give the ACLU money, and the ACLU should hire its own people, but whatever. So the fellowship process, for those who are interested and may not know, is long. It's drawn out, especially if you're applying for, a sponsored fellowship. So that's where you get a position at a public interest legal office. That can be anything from a larger organization like the ACLU to a really small legal services organization. And you get a spot there, but the money to fund your job actually comes externally. And then together with your host organization, you apply for money there are fellowships within certain schools. There's also not nationwide fellowships, et cetera. And it's a really long process. To give you a sense, I applied for my spot at the ACLU, I want to say in June of 2018, and I did not secure funding until May of 2019. So it was almost a full year-long process. And it is very hard to navigate that. I imagine it is very hard to navigate that at the same time as you are navigating clerkship applications because of the timing. And so I did not do them at the same time. I applied for the fellowships while I was clerking. And so I can't give that much advice as to how to do it at the same time. What I will say is that judges, if you were to get a clerkship and then you got a fellowship or you got something else, it's likely that the judge hasn't filled the spots after yours. And it's not unheard of to ask a judge, hey, I know you offered me a clerkship for 2022, but I just got this great fellowship. Could I clerk for you in 2023 or 2024? And if a judge really wants you, and they do if they've offered you that clerkship, then they will likely work something out with, or they will hopefully work something out with you. And it's much more, I think judges are much more flexible than fellowships, because fellowships come tied up with so many different interested parties, the host organization, the sponsor, the third party organization that matches sponsors with hosts. So it's very difficult to move the timeline for a fellowship, but it's a bit more likely that you may be able to negotiate with a judge your start date.
I'll add just one thing generally about this. Applies to anyone, but I think especially for T14 or non-T14 people or people with lower grades. The second you get an interview, and this is probably more applicable for not COVID. Like if you're for example, when I got my interview with my district court judge in California, I was flying from Michigan to California. It's also to address like Greg's point about financial concerns are a real big problem with interviewing. People like you have to jump on a plane within like a few days sometimes or a week, and it can be really expensive. I called every other federal judge in Los Angeles and said like, I'm coming to California. I want to interview with you. And like, I will be coming from Michigan, and here's my application. I emailed chambers. And like, that's how I actually got my second clerkship. My Ninth Circuit clerkship was entirely because I emailed someone and said, I am flying out. Do you want to interview me? So use like, during COVID, it's a little harder to be like, I'm doing a Zoom call, but like use whatever you can to, just like get into that room, because a lot of people who maybe don't look the greatest on paper are in fact going to be really, really great law clerks. And once you're in the room, you can show that.
All right, and maybe this will be our last question that just popped in. What are some key skills that you needed to have in order to be a successful law clerk? Please tell me before I start.
I'll try to start this out. You need to be okay with making mistakes, because you will make them, and that will not stop when you stop clerking. And I think that you have to be diligent in your work. I know that, we talked about this earlier, but like, there are going to be times where you don't italicize the right comma, or like something, or like a citation is off, and like that doesn't matter. But you also have to remember that you're representing someone when you do this sort of work. So I think being diligent, and I think the best advice that I got was to approach everything that you either email or give to the judge as though it's going to be published. And that way you start to get into the mindset of like, how does this have to look before it goes out? So you definitely want to do that. And I think, just the best skills, just be a good person and coworker. I think that that's something that's entirely important, and people don't talk about it enough. Is like, you're going to be in such a small group of folks that just be nice, be a good person, and your experience is exponentially better. And it's one of those things that's not necessarily a skill you get from law school, but it's like a life skill that's very important. And yeah, that's what I got for that one.
I will just say very briefly on that note, when I did interview with my judge, I was also interviewed by his current clerks, which is a relatively common practice. And he asked a bunch of questions. They were basically trying to figure out if I would be fun to have lunch with. Like, even though they weren't going to be my coworkers, like they were clearly trying to make sure that I was a nice person who would be enjoyable to have around the office for many hours every day. And I think that, it like can sound silly to like be yourself, be human, be friendly. But I do think that that is one of those things that, especially in the law school, neurotic, people are very obviously, understandably anxious about the process, does not always come through, and is something that can be really helpful.
Yes, and I think that's a standard practice that the current clerks do interview the applicants. And so I'm really glad that you raised that, Emma. And, you can also get a sense for what Chambers life is like in that interview, right? Because you can ask the current clerks questions. Now, you don't want to ask questions that could, you're trying to get them to tell on their judge or anything like that, but you get a sense of what the atmosphere is and how much the judge has to do with that atmosphere during that, interview process. And, adding on from what Greg just said, I learned just as much from my co-clerks than I did from my judge. And so, I think that law school can engender a lot of competitiveness. in law school, I did the best in classes where I worked with other students and worked with my friends. And the same is true of clerking. When you don't know something, ask if they have time, ask your co-clerks to read a draft of something that you've written, or even if it's an email, because as Greg said, if you're sending something from chambers, it is a reflection of that judge. And going at it alone in a clerkship, or frankly at any point in the legal profession, is just not going to be a successful strategy.
Yeah, on the skills list, I completely agree with every skill that's been talked about. The other skill I would say is don't be afraid to push back. It is difficult. You come from law school where you are taught to revere judges. You will find out that your judge is human in many, many ways. And I just mean, like, they're a person, they have opinions, they have biases, and hopefully if you can work for a judge who is a thoughtful, kind person, they will recognize that they make mistakes too, and that you are there because you are their advisor, and that there are times where you know the record better, you know the law better, you've done the research, and you know what the counter arguments are more than your judge does. So it can be really hard, especially I think for a lot of women and people of color, because you have a lot of imposter syndrome. You've been taught to respect judges and think about them as like these people who wrote like the cases in your textbook, but these are also people who are deciding really important issues for every individual who is in front of them, and you are there to help advise them. So don't shirk that duty. And like, just really quick anecdote, I had a case that really resonated with me because of my personal experience. It dealt with like issues at a convenience store, dealt with like immigrant background, like for some of the witnesses and the people who were testifying, and being able to sort of explain that to my judge, my unique perspective ended up being something that was really important to my judge, but I was worried about bringing it up for seeming unbiased or seeming like I was, the imposter syndrome got to me, and I thought I didn't really have anything to offer here. And I eventually did, and I would just think about, when you're clerking, the way to make this place better is to trust your judgment and to be your whole self in that environment to the extent that you can safely and happily do so, and push back, and that's how we get a more equitable judiciary, I think.
All right, I think with that, I'm going to cut us all off. Thank you all so much for sticking around. You should at this point have all of our contact information from the chat. So definitely, if there's specific questions about specific circuits or judges or weird things, maybe other than actually how to do anything in Oscar, because I think all of us have tried to forget that information, to be quite honest. Actually, last thing I will say to the couple of you that are on here, on the PPP website, there is a guide to applying for clerkships. It was written by our Harvard chapter at PPP. So it's Harvard specific for some of it in terms of like where things are on websites, but not all of it. And so that absolutely do not be turned off by the fact that it says Harvard. It can be a resource for everyone. There will just be pages that are not helpful to you, but you should take what you can from it. And we are trying to get a national version of it out soon. Thank you guys all so much.
Thank you, Clara and Greg.
Yes, thank you guys so much. And thank you for sticking around after, even though I sprung that on you at the last minute.
Thanks,
Happy
all.
to be here.
Yeah, same.
All
Bye.
right, bye everyone.